Hare Krishna, dear friends. Welcome to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. My name is Krishna Kishore Das, aka Christopher Fichi. We are honored and grateful to have you with us for this first batch of podcasts that we're doing in this series. And we're especially honored and grateful to have Yogesvaras Dasa, aka Joshua M. Greene, with us for this first series of conversations. And Yogeshvar, really grateful and honored to have you with us and really appreciative of your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I'll just give a quick introduction of Yogeshvar for those, many of you, of course, may know him personally or know who he is. For those of you who may not know him, he is author of several acclaimed books, including the bestseller Here Comes the Sun, The Spiritual and Musical Journey of George Harrison. And of course, Yogeshvar, you knew George back in the day. And Yogeshvar is also a scholar of Holocaust studies, and he has a book, Justice at Dachau, The Trials of an American Prosecutor, which was called a classic amongst Holocaust histories by Douglas Brinkley, who's a presidential historian for CNN. He's done documentary work on survivor testimony from the Holocaust. Witnesses, Voices from the Holocaust was the basis of a feature documentary for national PBS, and named one of the 10 best Holocaust films by Facets Media. He currently teaches mindfulness in the workplace for the Zarb School of Business at Hofstra University. And also you host your own podcast and you have your own website, Gita Wisdom, Teachings for the Modern Day Yogi, which explores such questions as what is a soul and how do we know when we have one? Is there a universe beyond what we can observe? How does yoga connect with issues in the news, which is what we'll talk about today. You can go to the website gitawisdom.org, which you can also find recommendations for books to read, places to visit, things to do, and ways to connect with others looking for intelligent, insightful company. Yogeshvar, you have been a devotee for many decades now, and one of the things we especially want to hear from devotees like yourself, who especially have had close relationships with Prabhupada, is a little bit of kind of the narrative journey of how you've come to the space you are now in life, where you do consider yourself a devotee who is socially engaged and who believes that social engagement is important for the practice of bhakti. So I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit about your journey to this point, and devotees, if you have some anecdotes with your encounters with Prabhupada, your relationship with him, we would love to hear that.
Sure. Thank you for that insightful question. Bear in mind the context. When those of us from the first generation presented ourselves for initiation to Srila Prabhupada, the background, to a large extent, obviously not everyone, but to a large extent, my generation came out of the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. We were experimenting with hallucinogens. We were reading books on spiritual journeys, and generally kicking up a fuss and rejecting what the parental generation and the establishment, as we called it, was doling out. When Srila Prabhupada came to New York, the reaction was curiosity. And then the more we heard from him, the more we learned what it was he was offering, the more it fit with the ethos of the day. Here is someone who, like us, was rejecting the establishment, which is to say, consumer materialistic mentality of just, get everything you can for yourself and to hell with the rest of the world. He rejected that. He had words of appreciation for his students who spoke out against injustice, against arbitrary governance, against sending young people to war who were not qualified to fight. And the wardrobe worked. I mean, we were already wearing strange, bell bottoms and beads, and so it wasn't such a big leap, into the devotee life. Of course, we were young and naive, and I don't believe there were many of us in that first generation who came to Krishna consciousness either from some spontaneous love of God or deep comprehension of the Vaishnava theology. I mean, that's just not the case. we came for other reasons. We came because the options available to us were unsatisfying. We came because there was some intuition that the wisdom cultures had something to offer. And here was one of the few people, remember, this is mid-60s here. There weren't that many spiritual teachers available. And Srila Prabhupada was very visible by the way he presented himself. He was uncompromising. I think there was a strength to him that was also very attractive. He had no problem standing up and speaking, as we say today, at truth to power. He spoke to the authorities with a very, very clear voice that if you are not guiding the citizenry back to Godhead, if you are not giving people the spiritual instruction they need to escape from the cycle of birth and death, then you are a demonic government. That kind of language was appealing to us. So that's just to kind of contextualize a little bit what it was like for those of us who dropped by in those early years.
One could probably argue that in this time of upheaval and change, that this, and I use this word understanding that it comes necessarily from a Abrahamic or Christian background, but Prabhupada's prophetic voice, as it were, especially concerning ecological issues, concerning how governments and economies function. I mean, there's numerous purports where he's very explicit in calling out just the demoniac, the evil, the unsustainable nature of how governments and society works. And you could argue that for devotees, but also for people who may be coming to the movement or encountering this philosophy for the first time now, in this time of upheaval, that language is also going to be very attractive in this time, place, and circumstance too. Yes,
certainly. I mean, we're experiencing a resonance 55 years later that very much was there in Srila Prabhupada's day, that we're called upon to step out of our comfort zone, if you will. We are called upon by our faith and by the teachings of Shastra to get involved in the work of society. I don't know that back then, by back then I mean 60s, 70s, I don't know that there were many of us who could have given scriptural rationale for social engagement. I don't think there were many people with sufficient command of the Shastric teachings that we could have explained those connections. How do these things fit together? How does nurturing one's own soul fit, which is an internal process, fit with the external process of social reform? Today, we're coming closer to being able to give that explanation. Back then, I don't think we could.
Yeah. One of the debates that I see going on, and one of the reasons that we are launching this podcast, this has been something that's emerged from the social initiatives at the Bhakti Center in New York, especially from the work of the Sacred Ecology Forum. And one of the reasons we're launching this podcast now has especially been what has been happening the past few weeks with the Black Lives Matter movement, with this real incredible upsurge of energy for justice, which is really rapidly changing the body politic of America in many different ways. And I've also observed, many other people have observed on social media, how many devotees are also kind of coming to an awareness of this, or expressing concern for this in ways that either they might not have known about before, or sometimes we do get a sense within our communities and our sanghas that it might not be so okay to express social concern. And there's this ambiguity that I know a lot of devotees have, where we're asking this question, whether this is okay to be concerned with justice movements. We're not entirely sure. We can look at some purports that Prabhupada presented where he says that one can be a politician, one can be a statesman, whatever your vocation is, to engage that within Krishna consciousness. And other times he's very strongly against welfare work as he described it, or engaging kind of in philanthropy solely focused on the body. And I'm wondering, either from your own conversations with Prabhupada, from your own realizations, it's really a kind of a fundamental question. And when we understand that not every devotee is obliged to engage in justice work, we also, I think what we're arguing in this podcast is to say that it actually is part of our tradition in an essential way. But that's the difficulty in parsing that out. So I'm wondering if you have anything specific from what you've heard from Prabhupada or your own realizations that might offer some clarity to this question.
Sure. You're saying all the right things. And I like your use of the phrase body politic, because that's very much what Prabhupada was pointing out, that the politics of the day were based on the body. And there is a direct connection between Vaishnav teachings and the work of the larger society. It is the challenge for us. By us, I mean not just the first generation, but also the second, third, and future generations, to evolve the vocabulary, to evolve the language, the phrasing, terminology, the vernacular, with which to make clear the contribution of Vaishnav teachings to the issues that confront us in the larger society. That's the challenge today. The challenge is not to turn away from those issues under the pretext that they are mundane social work, would have been the phrase in the day.
Yeah.
The only thing that made social work mundane was the fact that we were unable to connect the dots. Srila Prabhupada had absolutely no problem whatsoever with his students getting involved in decision-making, peacekeeping, alleviating the poverty, representing underrepresented minorities, all of which he was himself very active in, if you look at his behavior and the way he structured the administration of his movement. The issue was that people were at that time unable to justify, whether it be protesting systemic racism in America, with the teachings. Today, we should be in a better position to do that. After all, what is discrimination? What is racism? What is bigotry? What is anti-Semitism, if not a judging and condemning of a people based on the material definition of the body and the body's background? It's quite clear what we have to do, namely draw the connection between social ills and the solutions offered by Bhagavad Gita and the corpus of Vaishnava texts. We have a contribution to make. We have a contribution to make in the areas of environment, where the world itself, the planet itself, is viewed as sacred, as an incarnation of God, the Virata Rupa. Well, I mean, that's a low-hanging fruit right there. To be able to make the connection between Krishna consciousness and the environment movement. That's easy.
Yeah.
The harder parts, I think, are ones that involve more complex issues, more complicated economic and political histories, but it can be done.
Yeah. I want to come back in a little bit to this question about this use of mundane, because there's a really wonderful passage in your master's thesis on engaged Vaishnavism, where framing, as you use this frame in the thesis of this personality, Katam, who travels through different lifetimes, kind of experiencing different aspects of the evolution of Vedic philosophy, and eventually becomes a close associate of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he has this really wonderful conversation with a devotee about this use of the term mundane. I want to dig into that with you in a few minutes, but I think from my own experience, and I just finished a PhD at Union Theological Seminary, and I know a number of devotees who are also doing PhDs in historical work or other scholarly work.
Congratulations again, by the way.
Thank you. The skills that I've learned that others have learned, like in academic settings, or skills that other devotees learn in professional settings, there's was having a conversation with a friend yesterday about this, that, you know, for someone who might be more of a renunciate, who might be a brahmachari, who might be a sannyasi, obviously there's something in that vocation which, as someone who's renounced, may lead them to present their understanding of Krishna consciousness in a more kind of straightforward way. And that's actually, I mean, so essential to everything that we do. For those of us who are not renunciants, I mean, I did spend some time attempting to be brahmachari for about 5 years. Like, I know you've had this experience in that ashram as well. But for those of us who kind of step out into the world and we learn these kind of vocational skills, that's the question I'm always asking, is how do I take this training that I've gotten, use it in the professional world or use it in the movement world as a way to actually help people understand our philosophy? Because I certainly agree. For example, I'll read a short section. This is a purport from Canto 3, Chapter 5, verse 11. Prabhupada says, anyone who misunderstands this perishable body to be the self, and who works for it in the name of sociology, politics, philanthropy, altruism, nationalism, or internationalism, under the false plea of the bodily conception of life, is certainly a fool and does not know the implications of reality and unreality. He says, Krishna Katha is the only remedy for all people of the world because it can situate one in pure consciousness of the self and liberate one from material bondage. To preach Krishna Katha all over the world, as recommended by Lord Chaitanya, is the greatest missionary activity, and all sensible men and women of the world may join in this great movement started by Lord Chaitanya. And just to express my perhaps limited understanding of this, is not necessarily that certainly Prabhupada here may be condemning movements or any kind of political or social element which is just solely focused on the body. And I feel and others feel that we can be engaged in social movements, but not reduce our practice of bhakti to the social movements. It's about how we use the practice of bhakti to enhance these movements for justice, for dignity, for compassion, for humanity, for life. And there's been arguments, for example, with like the Black Lives Matter movement, that is not a spiritual movement. And I think that anyone who can look at the different kind of historical elements or the research that's led to Black Lives Matter knows that it's informed by a very deep infusion of Black spirituality from the Black church, from Black.
Can I tell you a Prabhupada story?
Yeah, please.
All right.
Yeah.
We were in Geneva, and he was receiving one guest after another. It was an amazing demonstration of his abilities to go, 18, 20 hours a day nonstop, talking and teaching and translating and giving direction. And at one point, a guest came from the International Labor Organization. The ILO is a branch of the United Nations that seeks to establish equitable, fair practice working conditions around the world. And they also get involved with trade policies. So before this man came, I described for Srila Prabhupada a little bit about who he was and his background and the nature of the ILO. So the man came in and very, very pleased to meet Srila Prabhupada. As soon as he sat down, Srila Prabhupada looked at him and said, "People wish to buy the best goods at the best price. Why, therefore, should there not be free trade?" I was like, what just happened here? Here was Srila Prabhupada, who represents, after all, Krishna consciousness and the Bhagavad Gita and the glory of bhakti yoga and so on, sitting down and talking with a representative from the International Labor Organization about free trade and reducing international tariffs on the import and export of goods. And it didn't take long before I realized, wow, this is what he does all the time. This is what he does with everybody. He makes them feel comfortable by finding the point of commonality between who they are, what they do, their interests and concerns, vocational activities, and Krishna consciousness. And I saw him do this time and time and time again, that because he wants people to understand that there is a relevance to these teachings, not only in terms of their own spiritual interests, but in terms of their vocational interests, in terms of their communal interests, in terms of their family interests, that there is a unity of value in what Krishna consciousness has to offer. And this, he did this time and time and time again. So I'm going to challenge what you said a minute ago, Kishore, about it's understandable that, you know, the celibates would maybe give Krishna consciousness a more direct presentation. Personally, I find that to be lazy spiritual life. I find that to be an obfuscation, an avoiding of the real challenge. Our work today is not to sit down and memorize verses from the Bhagavad Gita and demonstrate how big a scholar we are of Sanskrit when we give class. That's not our job. Those days are over. Those days are long gone. Our job is to demonstrate that we have something important to say in every sphere of human activity where there are challenges to be met, where there are problems to be solved, where there are people who are suffering and unhappy. I mean, bear in mind that ultimately that's our purpose. The purpose of our mission in Srila Prabhupada's society is not our own salvation and to hell with the rest of the world. Our mission is to demonstrate the value of Krishna consciousness so that people who are confronting sadness in their lives due to health issues, due to problematic family relations, due to exploitation by the government because their taxes are so high, they're just working to pay off their bills. I mean, you name it, there is something to be said. Within Srila Prabhupada's teachings, what we haven't learned yet is the language with which to describe that. That's what's missing here. So it's not a question of setting aside the challenge of finding a place for Krishna consciousness in business and industry, in healthcare and education, in family planning, in financial planning. There's a right way and a wrong way, a Krishna conscious way to go about managing your portfolio. I mean, everything is included under the umbrella of Krishna consciousness. We, to my way of thinking, have simply failed to give it sufficient attention.
And I think one example of that comes immediately to mind is that for those, there's this tremendous movement for divestment from fossil fuels, which a number of institutions, schools, colleges, people are encouraged by activists in the environmental world to actually divest money from fossil fuels as a way of creating effective change. Something that part of my kind of training at Union Seminary, we were part of that movement, and we always, was under a very clear understanding that it's a spiritual act to do this. We can say it's a devotional act to Earth and all of the creatures who are humans and creatures otherwise who are affected by climate change. Like that, this, even this seeming act which may benefit our portfolio is also a devotional act too. That's just kind of one example that comes to mind. Sure. And I wanted to turn to the Bhagavad Gita, of course. And what we were just talking about brings up the first verse from the 6th chapter, where Krishna tells Arjuna, one who is unattached to the fruits of work and works as he is obligated is in the renounced order of life. He is the true mystic, not he who lights no fire and performs no work. And always, I think this deeper understanding of the Gita, of what it means to act, what renunciation means, action, inaction, 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 is very subtle art that we're attempting to grasp in our practice of bhakti, and that not even the most renounced devotee is asked to light no fire. There always must be some kind of, light no fire and perform no work. There always must be some kind of engagement. We recently published a short op-ed in ISKCON News entitled What the Gita Says About Anger, very much in response to the protests and the incredible movements that are arising around Black Lives Matter and all of the interconnections related to that. And you ask in this op-ed, as devotees, should we protest at all? And as you relate from Arjuna's situation and what that meant in the context of the Gita, what it means in the context of our times, you say that Protest becomes a spiritual enterprise when it moves from vengeance to justice, when it reflects not hatred of our enemies, but compassion for their victims, and when we learn to see not enemies, but fellow spirit souls, misled perhaps, mistaken in their values, harmful, sometimes tragically so, in their actions, but worthy of respect as sparks of the same supreme being from whom we come. That vision is the dignity of all life, not just human, but other than human as well, is the real call from Sri Krishna that we are compelled to answer. And I think that just beautifully captures the mood that we should have towards all beings, especially those who suffer. One particular question I wanted to ask, because this is something that comes up a lot in my own work and experience, this term justice can be very much like a hot potato, as it were, amongst devotees, amongst others in the Hindu community, which I interact with. How do you understand justice, and why is it important? Is it important for devotees to appreciate justice, to participate in justice movements? And why is that something that, is it something that's supportive of our practice of bhakti, or is it something that's detrimental?
Well, be careful of using the word justice as though it were a legal term. It's not. It's a moral term. It's an ethical term. We don't expect justice in this world. This is an unjust world. It's a world of unfair leveraging by those in power over those who are powerless. It is particularly in our consumer American capitalist society, we live in an environment where the disenfranchised and those who do not have equal rights with white, predominantly male, white power brokers are at risk every single day of their lives. And that's just the way it's been since the dawn of our nation. And unfortunately, it's so endemic to the culture that it's awkward thinking in terms of justice. I think we might like, perhaps more realistically, to see an enactment of legislation which would allow for a better chance, better odds for people to enjoy constitutional safeguards and liberties equitably. But even that's a somewhat almost too noble goal. You know, here's the bottom line, and it's when I talk about this stuff in temples, I see people kind of rolling their eyes and scratching their heads because I think their misimpression is that I'm suggesting that instead of studying Bhagavad Gita and instead of worshiping the deity, we should go out and join the Black Lives Matters protest marches. And that's not the case. Obviously, that's not what I'm suggesting. Our basics have to be there. The fundamentals of our culture and our spiritual practice must always be respected. You know, we must chant 16 rounds a day. We must engage in deity worship. We must be careful about our diet. We must engage in some form of distribution of the knowledge. I won't say books because we're in a digital environment where non-print is as important as print, but certainly distributing the knowledge that we've been privileged to receive. All of that has to go on as it always has from the beginning. If, however, we limit ourselves just to those basics, then we've misunderstood the purpose of Srila Prabhupada's mission. If all that we do is the basics, and if our understanding of what Srila Prabhupada asked of us is so shallow as to think, well, if they just take prasadam and chant Hare Krishna, all problems will be solved, they haven't really thought carefully enough about this. The evidence that you have been chanting carefully, the evidence that you have understood what you've been reading in Srila Prabhupada's books, is that you will gain insight into the application of those teachings to the issues that confront the larger percentage of humanity. It's not some magic bullet. It's not some Aladdin's lamp. You know, you chant on your beads, and all of a sudden the slaughterhouses close, the brothels close, people are no longer angry and hurting one another, and the world lives happily ever after. That's not how it operates. You know, look at what is the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita was a political military action. I mean, I think sometimes we lose sight of that.
Yeah.
What Krishna was inciting Arjuna to do was diametrically the opposite of fulfilling the image of a spiritual guy. You know, if the purpose of Krishna consciousness is to not be involved in the world, if it's to worship the deity and chant our rounds, then why didn't Krishna praise Arjuna for wanting to leave the battlefield and go be spiritual? He didn't. He said, Kutas, where is this coming from? You're talking like a non-Aryan here. You know better than this. He was chastising Arjuna for not having gotten angry when he should have gotten angry. We have a responsibility, and to think that the work of the world is somehow divorced from the work of our spiritual life is dangerously naive.
Mm-hmm. For those of us who, I mean, for any of us, but I would also say for those of us who have some kind of training or vocational calling, like academic or in social work or in professional life, who want to take that training and provide it and look for kind of a synthesis of what we know best to do from our vocational training and the best of what we know to do from our training as a devotee. What would you say are maybe one or two of the most important elements we can bring from the Krishna conscious side to create that synthesis? Like what have you felt have been the teachings from our tradition which can really encourage us to be an effective, positive force for change in the world?
Right. I wish that question were asked every day in every temple in every country of the planet. Mm-hmm. I think that's what Srila Prabhupada was expecting of us by now. Mm-hmm. That would be the core question that we'd be addressing every single day of our lives. And I don't know whether it's addressed one day out of the year. I really don't know. But it's brilliant. As the sages said at the edge of the Naimisha forest, you know, your questions alone are glorious. So, I think, you know, I'm a bit of a Joseph Campbellite when it comes to this stuff. You know, I'd say follow your bliss. Mm-hmm. You know, if you have a particular inclination, whether it's to, home care, caring for people, whether it's, you know, being involved in media and communications, whether you have a technical orientation, IT kind of background, if you're a poet, an artist, a painter, a musician, a figure skater, you know, a cheese maker, you know, whatever your particular calling may be, mm-hmm. Study that. The first step that I would recommend for every one of our temples is to do a population survey. Sit down and appreciate more fully what it is that Krishna has already given us by getting to know the people around you. Mm-hmm. Sit down with your community. Tell my dear Prabhu, tell me about yourself. What's your background? What are the things that get you excited? What are your passions? What are the dreams that you have for serving in this lifetime? And then network. Collect people with similar complementary interests, form a group and turn them loose and let them go and support them. I suspect that we'll see a real turning point in the accelerated growth of Srila Prabhupada's mission when we learn that the best thing we can say is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. When we learn to say, I don't know, then we open the door to allowing the members of our community to come in with their own initiative, their own ideas, voluntarily take part in building new projects, expanding our horizons, lending insight into issues that we may think we understand, which frankly we don't. We have a little group that we get together every Tuesday. If you go to gitawisdom.org/events, you'll find out more about these gatherings. And a big part of what we do is get to know one another, try to understand who are the people involved. We have yoga teachers, of course. Well, we also have people who are hospital workers who have absolutely fascinating and very illuminating reports to give us about what it's like being on the inside of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have artists, we have people who are therapists, and we invite discussion where they get to tell us about their lives and how Krishna consciousness informs what they're doing. We have people serving in the military who can lend insight into the application of the teachings of the Gita on a battlefield. I mean, we just need to learn to be a little bit more curious about the people around us. And when we do that, I think we'll find that there are a lot more resources than we ever even imagined.
And I've personally been quite encouraged. My home temple here in New York, the Bhakti Center, which you're a part of as well, we have these social initiatives that we're developing, our sacred ecology forum. And I know we're going to have conversations with some of the devotees involved with this in future episodes of this podcast. And this sense that we can be outward looking in our bhakti. Like we don't have to be a temple that is kind of so hermetic. Like people can come and learn the beautiful foundation of Krishna consciousness, but also find outlets if they're interested in ecological change, if they're interested in this or that issue, if they're interested in prison reform, if they're interested in
absolutely
dying, like we just, yeah.
I'll give you two more Prabhupada stories, if I may.
Yeah, please.
One, when I was sitting with him in his room at Bhaktivedanta Manor, we were chanting japa, and outside one of the devotees, this was soon after George Harrison had gifted the manor to Srila Prabhupada, a devotee had set up a stage in the back and wanted to have kind of an Indian soiree for the neighbors, who after all were a little bit suspicious of what are these people, what are they doing in our beautiful neighborhood. So he had invited a rock band to play on stage, and there were colored lights, and he was serving a vegetarian dinner and so on. And just to kind of warm up the relationships with the neighbors. So this rock and roll music was coming through the window, and I asked Prabhupada, is this okay with you? He stood up, went to the window, looked out, and he saw the band playing, Rolling Stones or whatever it was. And turned to me and said, are they going to chant Hare Krishna? I said, I think that's the idea, is to kind of, warm up the show with this rock and roll stuff. And then when everyone is assembled, to get everyone chanting. And Prabhupada said, then it's okay. So I said, well, that confuses me, because it wasn't 2 weeks ago that you shut down the Traveling Roadshow. Back then, 73, 74, the Traveling Roadshow was 2 or 3 buses that had been outfitted with fold-out stages and sound systems. And they were going around doing skits and acts with a lot of original rock and roll music. And the idea was to recruit, basically, devotees from college campuses and so on. I said, how come you're okay with this rock and roll here out on the stage in the backyard at Bhaktivedanta Manor, but you weren't okay with the Traveling Roadshow? Prabhupada said, oh, I shut down the roadshow because it wasn't being properly managed. They were losing their spiritual business. In other words, because of the arduous travel schedule and so on, people were kind of slipping out of their regular daily devotional practices. But Prabhupada was someone for everything. He was someone for everything. There wasn't any idea that was so outrageous that he wasn't willing to consider it if it had value in terms of bringing Krishna consciousness to new audiences and in new ways. I can tell you from my own experience, that's the kind of person he was. As long as your sadhana was strong, as long as you weren't compromising your own spiritual life, he was open to any kind of idea that people could think of. So we shouldn't be afraid of that. We shouldn't be afraid of flexing our muscles, and coming up with good ideas. Best thing is bring it to the group, bring it, sit down with, people you trust and whose opinions you value, and see what they think. The worst that can happen is they might point out some defects in your ideas, and so you'll table that for a while.
So as we come to the conclusion of this conversation, as I mentioned before we started talking, there's the whole universe we're talking about here, so there's limitless conversations, and we'll continue these in future episodes. I wanted to come to something you wrote about in your master's thesis, Engaged Vaishnavism, that you did at Hofstra University. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, you use this narrative frame, this individual Katam, who you place him in different periods of history, ancient Vedic history, in the immediate context of the Bhagavad Gita and the Battle of Kurukshetra, and the way that that influenced society at the time. You then place him within the rise of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta from Shankar. And then you place him, it's kind of as you're going through these different lifetimes journey, then you place him as an intimate associate of Lord Chaitanya. And it's beautiful, and you have him experiencing the Ratha Yatra. I believe the Ratha Yatra is going on in some modified form in Puri today. And you describe how Katam is experiencing Mahaprabhu's ecstasies and being right, it's wonderful because it puts you right there, like in that experience. And at one point then Katam has this, Katam who's become a devotee, he's kind of had this, as many of us do, have a quarter life crisis or a midlife crisis and become a brahmachari. I know that was my experience. And he's talking with this fellow brahmachari Umapati. And at one point, Umapati is a senior to him, and he's telling Katam to keep going in the process. And he says, you have more to do still, here, now. If you truly wish to follow Chaitanya, you must first learn to see what is already in front of you. You will not find it by going away. And you go on to write that Umapati's words forced Katam to admit to what he had denied for so long, that God lives in the details of the life we have, and not in an imagined life we covet. He had been willing to do anything to break free from the mundane repetitions of life, anything except admit the possibility that mundane was a judgment he passed on what greater, more surrendered souls such as Umapati knew to be sacred. And that really struck me, because I think in the debates around social engagement, that term mundane gets tossed around quite a bit. And what I'm hearing from this is that, and going back to our conversation earlier about even someone in the renounced order of life has an obligation to be engaged, that we shouldn't think it's mundane to be engaged in life, to be even in a sense entangled in life in many ways. This is something from my own ecological studies. We're always interconnected, we're always interdependent. And to embrace that, and to not think that this work in the world is mundane. And I just wanted to share that, and I wanted to hear any thoughts you might have about, when we use that word as devotees, what we might be missing, as I think you're hinting to in this section of your thesis.
Yeah. Well, look, I've been doing this gig for more than 50 years now. I just turned 70. Mm-hmm. I was 19 when I first visited the London Temple back in '69. Over a half century of practicing Krishna consciousness. Here's what I can tell you. My observation is that many people I've known, and I've had the privilege of knowing some really wonderful, wonderful devotees. But, after 50 years, you get a real cross-section of people. A lot of people I've known take an arch conservative position, meaning that they're reluctant to think about getting more involved in social services, or the reason they give, and it's a valid reason, is they don't want to water down the process of Krishna consciousness. That there are other people who can take care of the impoverished, who can fight for the rights of African Americans. There are other people who can lead campaigns against political injustice, or whatever it may be. That our job is to be here so that when people are exhausted by their material life, they have a place to come where they will receive spiritual instruction. Well, that's a defensible argument. You can't just walk away from that.
Yeah.
But I think it's tragically short-sighted. The question then becomes, if God is there in the details everywhere, he would also be there in the details of making this contribution to the larger world.
Yeah.
So what is the real reason why we hear from some of the more conservative circles in ISKCON that we're not supposed to get involved? My observation has been that many of these people, not all of them, many of them have brought baggage into their spiritual practice that they started accumulating long before they ever visited a temple.
Mm.
People have issues with women in positions of authority, not because they've found scriptural justification for it, but it's because it's something they were uncomfortable with way before they ever became devotees.
Mm.
That if there are people who have biases, prejudices toward certain other social or cultural groups, they had those biases before. They've simply dragged that stuff into their Krishna conscious lives. And in that sense, all of history is autobiographical. You can present the same evidence to 5 different people. How is it you get 6 different interpretations? Mm-hmm. It's not because the information is different, but it's because each individual brings his or her biases based on a lifetime of experiences, of traumas, of tragedies, of prejudices. And the real work of Krishna consciousness comes when you're willing to turn that mirror around and start looking at yourself and saying, okay, why is it that I'm behaving this way? Mm-hmm. Why do I have these kind of knee-jerk reactions to getting involved as a movement, as a devotee, in helping other people who have material needs, who are compromised because the culture around them, the environment around them, does not favor them because they're from the Black community or the Hispanic community or from the LGBTQ community? Mm. Why am I so hesitant to get involved in those issues? Mm. I would suggest that if someone is at least willing to ask that question, what they'll find is that in that questioning is the opportunity for their own spiritual progress. Mm. And if they decline to ask that question, why am I responding so viscerally to these situations? They will get stuck and it'll be very hard for them to make spiritual progress. Mm-hmm. So I would suggest that people see the opportunity to get involved in social action, not as a distraction from Krishna consciousness, but the very core of Krishna conscious life, because that's where it gets tough and that's where you can make the most advancement.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is what we're hoping to do with this podcast, and what's so valuable about this conversation, I think, is hopefully to encourage devotees who might be stuck in that position to turn that mirror around. And I think also, I get the sense too, I mean, this might be colored by the Bhakti Center's kind of more progressive attitude, but I feel there's a lot of devotees who, understand that, kind of instinctually understand the connections that we're talking about around social engagement and devotional service. I see this a lot more in my Christian, Jewish, Muslim brothers and sisters and otherwise who are, there's an instinct for this, and not to say those traditions are perfect, I mean, in any way, but I feel like there's devotees, we may have this internal instinct to engage, but what I'm hoping with these conversations is to help to give us some language around it, some conceptual frameworks that can help us, and connections to Shastra and challenging questions that can help us to think through this. So I am very, very grateful for this, and we will continue this conversation soon in the many varieties of ways that it can be continued. And thank you so much for being part of this initial batch of podcasts that we're doing on Engaged Bhakti.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and you can check out our Facebook page, our YouTube channel for the first batch of podcasts, and the ones we'll continue to be putting out over the next couple of weeks. So, Hare Krishna, thank you very much.
I roll.